All right, everyone. Thank you for coming to Graphics Jump, Pros and Cons Between 2D and 3D. I am Vincent Kuyat. I am a game developer, and I've made a board game at Global Game Jam that was at MAGFest a few years ago that won Best Mechanics out of all the games that were made here. I've participated in Ludum Dare a few times, including a game called Small World Online that's tried to tackle the idea of addiction to MMORPGs to some degree. And I'm currently planning on getting a master's in game development from American University. I've been accepted, and I should be starting that in fall.
I'm Oliver Surplus. I work with mages, and I've always kind of wondered what exactly it is about 2D that's inherently more appealing, sometimes to the point where a 3D game, let's say Final Fantasy 13, just feels too intimidating to me, and these guys help me answer it, because that's why I'm here.
Awesome.
And that's not an excuse, I'm serious.
And my name's Meg Eden. I teach creative writing at the university level, and my novel Post-High School Reality Quest is in the form of a text adventure game.
Cool. And before we start, I have a tiny little intro, funny little thing. You might have heard of this video before, sequelitis. Just a little thing, snippet from that to get us started. So since we're talking about the difference between 2D and 3D games, and Zelda is one of the most prominent games that have had a 2D incarnation that is multiple 2D incarnations that are viewed as vastly superior to 3D incarnations, I figured that was appropriate. So my game plan for today is to kind of go through a bunch of game series and talk about the differences between them from when they've been 2D and 3D, either modern incarnations that are 3D like Sonic Mania, or just their old versions versus new ones like Super Metroid versus Metroid Prime. And just kind of look at what worked better in them, what worked worse in 2D versus 3D maybe. But in doing this, if you have a question or comment, please feel free to do so. And obviously, so this is kind of just a free-form conversation kind of thing, so feel free to interrupt us at any time to add your own points or thoughts. This really isn't us just trying to lecture at you. So the first thing I have on my notes is looking at Metroid, which is a series near and dear to my heart, considering Super Metroid is one of my favorite games of all time. Metroid Prime pretty closely behind that. And just kind of, that one's particularly interesting because that series has incarnations in 2D and 3D that are both widely beloved. Like I mentioned, Super Metroid and Metroid Prime are both really loved by fans. But there are some interesting things that I've thought of. I'm sorry, I'm kind of nervous. This is first time doing a panel with actual people, not like two people, so.
You can do it.
Yeah, bear with me a little bit as I'm trying to like organize my thoughts to a room of people that are paying attention to me. Actually, before I get into any of that, Oliver, did you have anything you wanted to say while I'm trying to figure out what I'm doing?
To me, right away with Metroid, the one that comes to mind right away is it's almost out of necessity. One of the defining aspects of Metroid is how chicken and the egg sequence breaking happened after the fact. And while it exists in the 3D integrations in Metroid Prime, they almost feel like exploits or like tricking the camera, kind of like the various ways through all the various versions of Metroid Prime that you could get the space jump early. Or some of the other ones, like some of the more useful ones, like in Metroid Prime 2. I can't even remember exactly how you do that one that allows you to skip over and fight Quadraxis right away. But there's just something about it that, like, we'll remember them very easily inherently in the 2D ones. The Mach Ball, the Shine Sparking can be considered one. And I don't know if that's just because of the way the presentation is, but it almost seems like it's an accident when it can happen, or perhaps even something they felt like they had to put it into the 3D entries. Because I'm not sure Corruption even has any sequence breaking.
It might. I don't remember. I haven't been keeping up super close to on speed runs with Corruption, but probably there's something somewhere they can find.
Oh, and I realized not everybody might know what I mean by the space jump. Like in the original version, you have to, like, I believe, hold down the camera, lock onto an enemy, and then let go at the precise time, which will allow you to do a dash. And that's I wouldn't say like doing the mock ball by comparison in Super Metroid is simple, but it feels a lot more intuitive in something like that. Whereas if you maybe, I guess what I'm trying to say is like think about it from a developer point of view. It seems like that's so specific that it's not necessarily programmed into the game, but might be a tool that they originally used for some purpose.
No, I think it's the getting space jump early in Metroid Prime. That's one he's talking about. Is actually a bug that they fixed in one of the later releases. Okay. Yeah, basically what happens is when you log on to an enemy in that game, you can do a side hop that is faster than your normal movement. And if you release the lock-on at the right time, you can keep that increased sideways movement, but also gain the height you would normally get from a normal jump, which allows you to get to this cliff that is normally completely inaccessible because you either can't move far enough to get there, or if you tried to go sideways, you just like hit the side of it and fall down. So it allowed you to get to something way earlier than you're supposed to, which kind of broke the game. One of the thoughts I've had about Metroid Prime that is very different from Super Metroid is the necessity of guidance that the game gives you. Because the world is so much more complicated in Prime, and just like a 3D world in general, you kind of need this hint system for the player to kind of figure out where they need to go, because otherwise you'd just be kind of lost and wandering around forever. For anybody who doesn't know what that is, I actually have a little clip to show that off. I did a lot of preparation. So let me do this. It would be Metroid Prime, that one.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So the game will occasionally show that little indication that's saying, hey, there's a thing you need to do over here, and then it'll show you exactly where you need to go and say, like, hey, this is something interesting you need to go look at. And that has kind of this, it's interesting because it does tell you exactly where you need to go, but it's also doesn't tell you what you need to do to get there, because as you saw, there's a huge area that was actually unexplored. So even though the game is telling you exactly where you need to go, there's still a sense of exploration going through these areas, finding secret passages, solving puzzles, fighting enemies, that sort of thing. Usually those lead up to a boss. That specific instance leads directly to a boss that gives you the, I don't remember if it's the bombs when you're in ball form.
Yeah, so many of those are so unobtrusive. I don't think it was until the ice beam, because it's pretty explicit, the hint, that I realized they were even giving hints, even though, like you just pointed out, it's kind of obvious when you reflect on it, but it seemed more like an extension like the scan visor, like, oh, this is a plot point, rather than that it felt like it was, even though it's pretty clear looking back on it, that it is leaning you forward as opposed to the scans, which is completely optional. Yeah,
exactly.
But yeah, I think the ice one says like low temperature, so that's an obvious hint. You know?
Exactly. But also, at the exact same time that they released Prime, they released a sibling game, Metroid Fusion, which features the exact same system. Every time you need to do something important, you go to a briefing room and it says, hey, go here. And in this one, it's actually showing you all the different corridors that you can go on. Usually, the game will download the map for the area, which is something you could do in Super Metroid, and then you'd say, hey, here's this room, go here. It doesn't tell you all the information. I don't think it tells you the exits you have, and sometimes you even have to find secret ways to go, or the map changes as you're exploring. But it does have that same system, which is interesting to look back at since Super Metroid did not. I think the brilliant thing that Super Metroid did is you could go download maps in that game in order to figure out where you need to go, but it didn't show you all the information, or didn't necessarily tell you exactly where to go. So you still had to explore, figure out what you were doing, and reveal the areas of the map that it wasn't telling you. So it would give you hints of things that you could do, and you had to yourself go figure out what it was you needed to do. Yeah, exactly. And Fusion and Prime are like, here's the boss. Super says, here's an area. Have fun with that. It did tell you where the bosses were, didn't it? But you usually didn't have access to that until you'd explored more. Specific. Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh. That guy's a jerk unless you know his secret. specifically, I'm thinking of Kraid when I'm thinking of this. I think the game tells you where Kraid is, and it's in a really weird area. But you can't get to Kraid until you get super missiles, and you have to go find something that isn't specifically marked in order to do that. So this is something I don't actually have an answer for, because it's kind of a hard question, I think, in that why did Prime work so well when so many 3D games have flopped so hard in that transition? You know, things like, you know, Bubsy 3D, which I'll bring up a bit later.
Yeah.
Why did Prime work? And I don't necessarily have an answer for that, but the closest thing I can think is that they examined what a player wants to do in a Metroid game, which is explore, and figured out the absolute minimum number of things that they can give the player in order to figure out where they need to go without hand-holding them or specifically maybe railroading them or anything like that. And also giving you a whole lot of other things you can do in the game, like scanning enemies, scanning lore bits, that sort of thing, to keep the game interesting, while also retaining a lot of the tropes that Metroid games have, you know, super bombs, super missiles, you get at one point missiles, different beams, that sort of thing. And just re-examine, and kind of, I guess, putting every trope of the game on a platform and looking at it and saying, well, how does that fit here, and should it fit, and what new things can we do to enhance that? Visors are one thing that they added to the game that had an interesting extra element of exploration that the other games didn't have, which could be done in 2D but haven't. One other interesting thing to note about the Prime games is the differences in controls between the GameCube iterations and the Wii iterations, particularly when they backported the Wii controls from Corruption to the original trilogy into 1 and 2, and how that changed how you interacted with the world, where you had to aim more precisely instead of locking onto things. So, again, another interesting game that is a weird hybrid, and we're just going to ignore the story here. We're talking about mechanics. Metroid Other M is a game that, leaving the story aside, I actually quite enjoyed for the mechanics it had, and were actually fascinating mechanics because it combines so many different elements. It had kind of a side-scrolling element to it, kind of a 3D exploration element to it, and also kind of a first-person element to it. That kind of is this weird intersection between both a Prime and Super, which I again have a demonstration of that. Let's bring that over. Can I drag this, please? Thank you.
It's working well.
Yep. So you see right now they're kind of exploring almost like a 2D Metroid, but you have a little bit more freedom, but really it's still a linear hallway like Super would have. You know,
Oh, yeah.
good question. Can we?
I'm trying to remember where they are. Oh, yeah, they're over there. I don't believe I need a code.
But you're facing forward this way as opposed to the side scroller kind of.
Yeah. But mechanically, it interacts similarly to a side-scroller because you
the
just have that
angle's
one
different.
hallway, whereas in Super, you would just be going sideways instead of this way. And there are segments in Other M where you go sideways, particularly the so well-known Hell Run section of the game where you're moving sideways without your variasuit. But it also has that first-person element that brings a new style of control where you kind of get locked in place. Okay. Sorry about that. So it's this odd hybrid between the two, and mechanically I think that actually works because it retains the way you would explore in, say, Super Metroid, but also brings in like first-person shooting and whatnot from Prime. So, okay, this one, I'm going to move on to another game, unless anybody has any comments they'd like to bring in about the Metroid series. Meg, do you have anything you'd like to say?
No, I'm not really like
Okay.
a Metroid player.
I
so
did
I'm
have
like, "Ugh."
one thing thought, while getting into the levity of obviously of what how much of an amazing situation Metroid Prime was, especially when you consider where what country was developed and especially what state. It's almost like the virtue of Other M is the screw attack, probably more than anything. Of all the, let's see, leeway / compensation they had to make in order to make Metroid into 3D as well as it turned out, I don't know if it was like something they determined early on, but it was pretty clear that they couldn't put it into 1, probably because they couldn't figure out how to make it work, and they didn't exactly come up with a better solution for 2. It's really only used in puzzles and some occasional annoying enemies. And 3, you get it a little bit earlier, but compared to, it does what it's supposed to in Other M, it seemed like it was like a niggling thing. They couldn't quite figure out what to make it the screw attack, which is, if you're not familiar with that, it's you just jump into an enemy and it kills them instantly. And it seems like either they knew they couldn't do that right away in Metroid, or they just kind of racked their brain for a long time about how to implement it.
Yeah, the interesting anecdote about that, I think Prime 2 is when they brought it in originally.
Yeah, and pretty late in the game, too.
Yeah, they didn't actually intend to put that in the game.
At all? Okay.
No, they didn't. They had a concept of it that ended up getting shown at a like game show or something like that, and the developers were like, crap, we need to figure out how to do this now because somebody showed it off and everybody's going to hold our feet to the fire if we don't put this in the actual game. But yeah, that is interesting that the way that Other M plays facilitates the like screw attack like a lot better than the 3D games because you have that kind of side-scrolling aspect to it. But yeah, now we're going to move on to talking about Sonic. Sonic has had a very rocky history. It does not have all that many 3D games that people actually like. Just looking at you, Sonic 06, wait, you're still a beta. So I wanted to do a quick comparison. These are both going to be 2D Sonic games between a recently released one and an old one. And the one on your left is Sonic 3 and Knuckles, and the one on your right is Sonic Mania. One of the most interesting things that I've realized about Sonic is that it isn't, despite its marketing, it isn't really a game necessarily about going super fast all the time, because the later levels are mostly about platforming and puzzles and that sort of thing, and not about going super duper fast. And I think one of the reasons for that is the limitation in view distance. If you look at Sonic 3 versus Sonic Mania actually has a little bit more that it can see and gives you a little bit more of a heads up of what's upcoming, spikes, enemies, that sort of thing, so you have a little bit more chance to react. Whereas Sonic 3 and Knuckles, you really don't have a ton of time to react if you're going very fast. And that gives this limitation that they kind of needed to focus on other things later on because, I mean, you can go around loops and stuff all you want, but that only stays really interesting the first few times. After that, you need something else.
Well,
yeah.
it's frustrating.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I can't remember the name of it, but there was a textbook written by Tristan Donovan which talked about Sonic, and around the time it was being made, remembering this correct, it was meant to be a rival to Sonic, except rather than being aimed at children, it was being aimed at teenagers, so it had a lot of the same platform aspects. One big difference is that, unlike Mario, if you're like familiar with the level you're not good at, they wanted to give the player the ability to like go through it faster if they wanted to, whereas in Mario, you're forced to go through it the same speed every time you play through it, which is a little more punishing for players who might be better at the game and would be rewarded for being able to go through it blindingly fast speeds. So I believe that in the case of Sonic, at its core, it's just a platformer along the lines of Mario, but it has that, it gives the player the option to go through really, really fast if they're really familiar with the level.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, I think
if speed's used that way, it's more effective.
Yeah.
Because it punishes if you don't know and then you run into something you couldn't see.
yeah. Yeah, that's definitely an interesting aspect to it is like memorizing levels so you can go fast and kind of show off. I think Mario games did have some aspect of that. If you watch somebody who's really good at like the original Mario game, they just right through a level really quickly and do tiny little jumps off of like the absolute corner of things, and so there is a high skill ceiling for Mario games as well. Though maybe
Looks different.
Yeah, it just looks different, and maybe some of the later Mario games not so much. Whereas Sonic, maybe you could go really, really fast. But the really interesting thing is that in 2D, it's hard to make something in 2D that you can have enough warning when going at high speeds in order to react to. If you start zooming out more and more and more, it starts becoming very hard to see where anything is at any one time. So you wouldn't be able to see, like you would see this little teeny thing of Sonic, but it would be really hard to track exactly where he is. But in 3D, it can become a lot easier to see where you are or even see ahead. Where's the one I want? Ah, that's where it is. I have a demonstration of that from Sonic Adventure 2. bring this up. There it is. Okay, thank you. Oh, there it goes. I think that looks good.
Yay!
Okay, this is a little glitchy. I'm sure it'll be fine. If you look at this, look at how far down the road. I mean, you can't super well see it because of Sonic's model, but I mean, you can see a lot farther down the road and see what's upcoming a lot better.
And prepare yourself.
Yeah, and prepare for it than you could in something like Sonic Mania or Sonic 3 more specifically. You know, you compare what the view distance you could see in what I was just showing you to what you can see here or here, and it really starts to feel kind of constrained. And so I would actually argue that the 3D games are more focused on going fast, which is the original marketing premise of Sonic, than the 2D games are, because of the ability to just see really far. So do I have another?
Oh,
Yeah.
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 I think one thing worth asking yourself though is, was speed what made Sonic really fun? Because I look back at the times I was playing the 2D Sonics, and it was, it wasn't one of those moments where I was going through loop-de-loops going really fast that made the game fun. It was when I was like fighting enemies or like navigating platforms or doing weird things like snowboarding and stuff, or slot machine. I don't think the speed, like just moving really fast inherently was what made the game fun. I think it was everything else, but. And I think going to 3D, maybe there was.
Yeah. That's what I was exactly going to say, that whole like phrase of gotta go fast, and like,
Yeah.
I mean, he was like marketed, and I mean, they were trying to market Sonic as kind of this rebellious teenage kind of, I think they based his shoes off like Michael Jackson's shoes or something. So like, it feels like there's like this trend in the marketing to like have your expectation as a player of like, oh, it's all about speed, when actually if you're playing the game, it's like, that doesn't really help. And yeah.
Supposed to be the antithesis of Mario.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Short, lumpy,
It's
Cute.
Italian.
Hedgehog, Italian.
It's somewhat dishonest because, you know, you have Labyrinth Zone and even parts of Spring Yard Zone to counter that. It's almost like the marketers didn't bother, if they even did, probably not back then and not necessarily nowadays, to even demo the game. You know, they come out with it after. And to me, if I can switch genres, the most egregious example ever was in the advertising for Modern Warfare 3. You know, they had the Mountain Dew campaign, contrasting that with a very serious storyline, completely missing the point of the villain's dialogue. So it's clear that they totally didn't talk to each other, the different teams. But Sonic
Well, that
is
can be
another
more
good,
complicated.
Sonic
Yeah.
is another good example of like, we're going to market it fast, even though if it's not accurate. And it's almost like it got its claws in it, because I often do hear Labyrinth Zone criticized. It's different, but I wouldn't call it bad, you know. And I think people primarily criticize it because it's not fast, or you're not able to play it fast.
Yeah. So on the topic of going fast and the idea that maybe Sonic wasn't actually about going fast, very serendipitous, because I was just about to play this video from Sonic Generations, the modern style of gameplay, which are all about going fast.
Gotta go fast.
Exactly.
But this design makes it much more satisfying to go fast. I
Yes.
feel like you can feel the thrill of like, instead of in the other games where you just run into something and then be angry.
Exactly. I think there are two strengths that Sonic has, and Sonic Generations focuses on both of those strengths. One is the ability to go fast, like we saw there, where it's just really satisfying to go through a level really quickly, and it does so by constraining you. You have like one area that you can be in at any one time. Now, given they did have good level design, so you had like multiple different paths you could take, so you could be rewarded for being like knowing the level or being good at playing by taking a more optimal path, or a path that has more rewards or something. But it was all about going fast, which is the original premise, and that's why I say like 3D allows you to have a Sonic game that focuses on actually going fast. But they also had the more classic style 2D, like jump around, do platforming, that sort of thing, that isn't really focused on going fast. And I think that they've they realized that when they made the game and were a little bit more aware of that, which is why they kind of split the two play styles up, and even why they kind of had the different designs for the two Sonics, where one is like sleek and feels like you should be running fast, and the other's kind of like frumpy and small and feels like you should be platforming.
Yeah. I always go to, I believe it's the 4th episode of Aqua Teen. That marketing always reminds me, it's like, our vertical leap is beyond all measure. It's like, so you're saying your culture is more advanced because you can jump higher? It's like, come and explain it to these guys. And that's essentially what the marketing was trying to convince us of, and we didn't really fall for it, I hope.
No, people totally fell for it.
Come here and explain our advanced ways.
To add one more... Add one more little picture to this whole collage we've been making. Here's Sonic Generations again with the 2D platforming sections where you can, it's hard to control this backwards. You can compare that to Sonic Mania, where the one has a little bit, seems to have a little bit more view distance than the other, even though maybe it's not as clear where anything is at any one time. Like, this has a very clear distinction on colors, like this is very distinct from the blue in the background, and allows you to kind of get a good grasp of where things are, whereas maybe this one's a little bit harder to kind of distinguish that because of the layering and all the different bits of detail going on in the background.
Well, and that's something we talked about at Retro Game Con, is like the design aspects of when you're designing in 2D versus 3D. With 3D, it's so much easier to get busy. Like, there's so many textures, so many different colors, or actually the lack of different colors, it's all these different shades of green, and with 2D there's more limitations on the number of colors you can have and the amount of things you can really do, because it's really just that bit look. So it actually is kind of beneficial for a viewer to be able to distinguish, like, here's where Sonic is, as opposed to the other one where, like, I have to actually look, it's almost like a Where's Waldo, of like, where is Sonic?
Where is he in all of these bits of scenery?
Yeah.
Which, it works better in motion, but you can tell better in motion, but it's still less distinct.
Yeah.
Are you seeing the default background for Ubuntu over there? I feel like right, so I was going to add on to what she was saying and say that one of the things that people who are making 3D games have realized is that it's more important to have a silhouette that's distinct than colors that are distinct. 2D is all about the color palette and making sure that, like, the main character is distinct from everything else. Look at something like, what's that recent game that, Freedom Planet, where the main character is purple. There isn't a whole lot of purple in that game. Or I think she's Violent, I guess, technically, because that's her name. And that makes her very distinct from everything else, which is, you know, cool blues, bright greens, that sort of thing. Whereas when people are making stuff like Overwatch or Team Fortress 2, they focus on the silhouette. So no matter what, when you look at them, it doesn't matter what color they are, you see that guy is huge, he's a heavy. That guy is thin and kind of tall, he's a spy. That guy is, like, kind of squat, he's a pyro. Like, it's really easy to tell who's who, not because they're colors, but because of their silhouettes. And so there's a different focus you have to have when designing for the two in order to make things distinct. And color can be part of that, so when you're designing a static level, you can have yellow rings that are distinct from the green background, but it's still a lot better to have a silhouette that is very distinguishable. Let's see.
Yes.
Yes. No, Castlevania.
That's a great example.
The original Castlevania is fantastic in that regard for keeping things very distinct from who is who in that. Which, when you compare it to Simon's Quest, everything becomes really muddy.
Yep.
If you want to talk earth tones, playing Faxanadu recently, it's really, that game is very, and I mean, it works because it's a dying world in that game, but it almost seems like you could have mixed it up a little bit, you know, like the interior of the castles you go into, but it's not really a fault though. It kind of marks it's pretty unique.
Yeah.
You remember Faxanadu?
I don't think I've played that one. Yeah, I mean, Simon's Quest was basically every color you want as long as it's the color of dirt.
That's a good way to describe it.
So can we talk about the dreaded Bubsy 3D now?
Oh.
Yeah, unfortunately, I did not get a. Actually, did I get a sample of that? I think I actually did pull down.
I think for those that have seen Bubsy 3D, it's ingrained and burned in their memory.
A little bit, yes. I do actually have a Bubsy 3D. Let me talk for a second while I pull this up. you can talk about Bubsy 3D and how awful it is.
So I guess something that's interesting about, so if you think about Bubsy 3D and Mario 64, they were developed at the same time, separately, trying to figure out how the heck do we make a game in 3D. And so it's really an interesting example to see how two different places created two very different solutions, and one of them works and one of them really doesn't.
Bubsy 3D. Isn't it beautiful, everyone? Look at that majestic art. Yeah, it's Bubsy 3D came out in was being developed at a very interesting time because it was literally being developed in parallel with Mario 64. Yeah. And I cannot attribute it to myself for finding this quote. I can only attribute it to Did You Know Gaming, but they talked about how when this game was being made, and they premiered it at a game show or showing it off, and they also saw Mario 64, which is being shown for the first time, and they saw the controls for that and just sort of were like, crap. Yeah. This game sucks in comparison to that. We're screwed. We need to remake this. And, I mean, look at that jump. That's just awful. It's shameful.
Shameful.
And they just didn't have the time or money in order to retool it to be something that actually feels good to play or even looks good. And which the developers did desire at the time when they saw Mario 64 and realized what the control difference. But part of the reason I think for why Bubsy 3D was made as it is because they, as far as I'm aware, around the time they were used to using tank controls. Which, if you don't know what tank controls are, it's what the game plays. You hit forward and you go forward. You hit left and right, you start turning, exactly like a tank can do. They can't go sideways, side to side, go this direction when they're facing this direction. That you control like a tank. And so they were just using kind of what they knew at the time and trying to build a 3D platformer around that, whereas the Mario 64 developers, just kind of like Nintendo usually does, rethought how a game should play based on new technology they might have. At the time, they were making the analog joystick, which was brand new to the industry at the time, and nobody else had that except for the N64. One of the first games to use an analog joystick on PlayStation was like Ape Escape or something. So they didn't have that, so they didn't sit there and go, huh, so if I just take this and go in this direction, what happens? They just had left, right, up, down. And so they kind of had that advantage of forward thinking of the analog joystick and thinking, okay, what happens when I do this? So I go that way, obviously. And that caused them to just create this game that plays just so badly because it's trying to force a style of control onto a game that really should not for that genre.
I don't know if it's worth it. I mean, I'm guessing the panels on, I believe it's tomorrow, on video game preservation could probably tell us better. But given what we know about that, it's almost like, well, the obvious solution would have been to continue to make it in 2D, but maybe that would have been a non-starter because the Bubsy games in 2D aren't great necessarily either. No. So they felt like, oh, we can at least be innovative. But
and I think the developer was like, I can come back only if we do a 3D game. I think he set that term, which is probably what directed a lot of it too.
Yeah, that is. Yeah.
The one that comes to mind is, as good of a port it is of Street Fighter II on the TurboGrafx, someone actually modified the engine, I forgot exactly how, so they could increase the number of control inputs and allow you to, and it wasn't just a matter of like what they did with the 3DO, making it work with another controller, so that really like, I don't know, it's the closest example I can think of, but it almost makes me wonder, like, maybe if someone had a really, like, masochistic streak, they could take a look at Bubsy, and just for the history of video gaming, maybe make something out of it, because it's not necessarily a willful decision on the part of the developers, you know?
Yeah.
They were, you know, they weren't trying to deceive anybody. They were probably trying to make something good.
Oh, yeah, no,
not twirling any mustaches, you know? We're going to screw people over, yeah.
I'm sure they were doing the best they could to make a game, but just within the limitations that they could think of. And unfortunately, the company just probably didn't have enough money in order to make a really good game. I mean, even if you just look at the art design, it's bad. The main enemies are snot monsters or something. It's just bad.
But I think what's interesting about this is it shows how different 3D was from 2D. You have to think in a completely different way when designing a game. And something like Bubsy, they were trying to think in a way that have how you make 2D games onto something 3D. So I think the moral is just they're so different, you just have to think differently in making them.
Yeah, you really do, because in one example to bring up of a game that blends 2D and 3D is Super Paper Mario, if I remember correctly, the Wii
Yes.
version, where
Yes.
you actually have the ability to go from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions, and that allows you to solve puzzles in different ways. Because, like, in 3 dimensions, maybe you can go behind the scenery and go across this uncrossable chasm, or maybe there's a bridge in the background or something. And so they have this kind of bridge between the two that makes sense for that game, but that's the kind of thing you have to think about is like, all right, it's an interesting example of looking at a 2D game and realizing just how much harder it is to make it 3D. Because as soon as you turn that 2D world of Super Paper Mario 3D, all of a sudden there's a new element to the level. There's a bridge or something. And in 3D, you have to think about that. You can't just have this chasm, this little teeny chasm here that you can't cross. You have to actually have this, like a giant trench that they can't cross, or like a broken bridge or invisible walls or any number of things to prevent them from crossing that, rather than just, there's nothing here now. You have to think about a whole lot more things in order to do that. Let's see here. I'm going to skip ahead a few of the games that I have notes for and go to Zelda, because I have a video for that. And I'm just going to go straight into this video, because I think it probably talks a lot more eloquently than I can. Let's see here. It's going to be that one. Oh, I think that's the logo for Ubuntu 17.10 or something, just the specific version they have. I don't know exactly what it is. Maybe it's an anteater or an aardvark.
Anteater, yeah.
Yeah, they always name their releases after animals, so like, what would be an A word? Ambitious anteater or something like that.
It's clearly a tapir.
And I've just never changed the background for my computer, so there you go.
And this is against sequelitis.
You should watch the full videos for all of Sequelitis because they are fantastic,
Yeah.
by the way. What?
Unfortunately, no.
No. I think the last new one is the Zelda one, which I think this pulls from.
Santa the Hedgehog over here. It's been turning a 2D game into a 3D game. It ain't easy. It ain't even fucking quantifiable. How do you take the simplicity of form that 2D allows, give it a
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Everything changes. And it seems to turn a really good game design into a completely fucking broken
Yeah.
situations analogous to reality, the more you have to stipulate on. You can't hit a bat from any Z-axis position distance. Now it's really clear where the bats are in 3D space. They're up, down, every fucking where. Maybe you're sort of retarded. Z-axis problem. Ladies and gents, I present you Z target. That you have flying from every which way, trying to circle around the stop post without losing track of where it is relative to you. Have I got a treat for you? Just press the Z button and walk up to the nearest batty and have a go with your right sword device. Check it out. Z targeting made combat complicated. That's not a bad thing. No more simple point and swing stuff here, folks. You get a lock on, focus on the button. This is a gigantic difference. It makes combat complex. I don't say this a lot, but let's see how this is a good thing. A new method of combat means new ways to go about designing enemies in combat situations. You used to just point and hit and run. Now, rolling, dodging, stabbing, swinging, leaping, holy shit, so complex, so many possibilities. It's so deep they can make an entire game based on the combat system. But guess what? They didn't tear down the stability. Targeting creates a strange disconnect from the world around you. It changes the camera angle from what you're used to exploring the world in, and that shifts your entire focus and outlook. It segments the game into two pieces. This is the combat piece, this is the world exploring piece. They don't mix. Put them in a room together, you get into an argument. Hey, fuck you, and fuck you too. Can't we just get along? What do you think this is? Wait for the past? Like the man said, in the old Zelda games, those two pieces were linked. There were segments where you had to fight off enemies and explore the room simultaneously. It was much Targeting also puts a damper on throwaway enemies like bats, who weren't fun to kill in previous Zeldas, but are now a pain in the goddamn ass since you have to individually focus on each one and precisely hit them. It'd be like if you wanted to kill a bunch of ants in your house by stomping on them, but instead of doing that, pointed a slingshot at each one individually. Now, okay.
Yeah, that really exemplifies what I think is the main problem with Ocarina, is that it, it's not just storyline, but I feel like that's what I mean, and I'm glad to see that example when I refer to pacing problems. And more definitively, the obvious bugbear, similar to Metroid Prime, is the fact that there were no whiz robes in Ocarina of Time. And unfortunately, when they did put them in Majora's Mask, they completely changed the way you had to fight them, because headaches, that just couldn't work in 3D, even with the Z targeting. So it's like they had to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And they're certainly annoying in the 2D games, but I don't think what they came up with in the 3D games was really better or memorable in its own ways.
So the whiz robes were the enemies that you had to bounce their projectile back at them, or I'm trying to remember which one they were.
I don't think you have to even do that in Majora's Mask. They just teleport around and you can just fight them conventionally.
Well, so I was thinking the original games.
No, you don't. They kind of move. There's the blue ones that move all over the place.
And they teleport?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't remember them as much. Can you kill them with by reflecting? Because I know in Zelda 2 you can, but we don't really talk about Zelda 2. The whiz robes, reflecting their stuff.
Yeah.
I don't remember Wind Waker if you could kill them that way.
Well, it's interesting you bring up whiz robes that kind of teleport all over the place, but like he was pointing out, you can see where they are, and it's easy to see them. And I don't remember if it's Wind Waker or Majora's Mask, or just maybe most of the Zelda games. There is a boss that clones themselves or like teleports to specific locations. You have to kind of have to look around to find out where they are. And the only reason that that's remotely challenging is because you can't see the entire room at the same time. Later in different parts of this video, he talks about how, it's not really a puzzle to kind of look around to find a soulless crevice to whack a crystal. And that's that applies to the concept of a whiz robe as well. It's like, well, the only reason this is hard is I'm looking this way and they're here. And that's just irritating. That's not hard, it's just irritating. So having imperfect information of the room creates an irritation, whereas in 2D, top-down, it wasn't even a problem. Yes, sir?
Right, you're saying that the problem is that just having a whiz robe teleport somewhere where you can't see them is frustrating, correct?
Yeah.
Because
The limitation of point of view.
can fix that problem with audio cues, because if you can hear the direction that they're in, that can sort of fix the problem. You can know where everything is, even though you can't see them.
In that case, good thought. It might have been an apparent casualty of the fact that the N64 sound chip was far less sophisticated than the SNES one. Can't prove that, just a quick thought based on what you said.
Yeah.
But it was notably tinnier in many cases, especially with what chiptune artists and various hackers have been able to do with that thing. It was pretty sophisticated for its time.
If you want to go one step further with that, that's probably the basis of all VR games now. You have to use your senses, not the senses given to you by the game, but the 2D standpoint, because they show you the room and that's what you're given. But in the VR, and especially VR is a 3D setup, you got your headphones on, you have to use your senses to use around you, whether they be visual, like some sort of light happens over there, and you look around. I mean, it was definitely harder back in the N64 days.
Mhm.
But I feel like most of the problems that, he's comparing, the problem with sequelitis is that he was comparing the end of the 2D, major era for Zelda to the very beginning of the
Yeah. It's sometimes not certainly on the level of Bernie Stoller type antics, who completely loathe 2D in every way, the president of Sega, but sometimes you'll occasionally see stuff like, the SNES 2D couldn't do transparencies, but there's actually quite a few games that can. Bahamut Lagoon, so it's like a needless wall that's put up, kind of like what you were trying to say. But that is relevant, the end of an era. Gradius 3, R-Type, early Super Nintendo game, Slow Down City, and not just because of the hardware and stuff like that. So
Well, they're still figuring out how to do this,
Yeah.
but I think it's valuable for us to look at this if we're thinking about how do you make a game in 2D versus 3D. A new problem is created in the 3D with Ocarina of Time that would just have to be resolved in some way, whether it's the sound or some other way.
expectations, I guess, what I was trying to hint at too.
Yeah.
We
were all just like, wow, it's 3D.
Exactly.
Like, I mean,
That
we
intro
didn't
video.
really even think about the problems.
expectations are weird though, because I don't know really anyone who likes whiz robes, but it's almost like a matter of course. You know, you have to have them in the games. It's kind of like when I look back on it for Breath of the Wild, it's like, what took so damn long with Lionels? I love that they're back, you know? And yes, they were there in various forms, but what they did with them I just think is amazing. You know?
And to address the audio cues, before we get to you, sir, I see your hand, is in the N64 days or PS1, PS2 days, when you're using a CRT TV, you don't really have a good indication of where something is from an audio cue. There's one direction the sound is coming from. With a VR headset, you either have stereo sound or even tries to emulate three-dimensional sound, which I know that headphones can do, in order to determine, like, something's behind me, something's here, whereas, you know, if you hear a sound, it's like, all right, is that left or right?
The bane of that solution is the mono or stereo switch in the game.
Yeah.
Do never turn on mono.
Unless you're watching the original Terminator, then very much do that.
What was your question?
Okay, so is there a specific game that you all have played that you think exemplifies how to deal with this problem really well? That like manages to combine the combat and exploration? Because I think with the original Zelda, the problem you're running into is that now that you cannot see the full room, you're going to end up in situations with two different objectives, like sword duels with enemies, and then searching through and finding things. And because it's in 3D, it's more of like a movie-like camera, where if it was a film, the way they would film combat scene would be different from the way they film exploration. But if they have the camera lingering and they don't know what the player will pick, it seems to me that allowing them to choose one or the other is more of a solution to the intrinsic problem of 3D stuff, even if it's kind of a flaw in it. So I guess for the three of you, which is the game you've seen that you think handles this really well?
Great question.
The first thought I do have initially was kind of what you were hinting at about like the fine-tuning of 2D. One, when I was reading into the history of Zelda that's interesting is, I guess I'm just going to say Oracle of Seasons, because that's the one that's most similar to the original Legend of Zelda. It was intended to be a remake originally, but then they ran into resolution problems, not being able to see the whole room, so they kind of had to refix it and stuff, because when you think of the widespread appeal of Zelda's age, you could, of the people who play Zelda, you could very much conceive like someone who doesn't know to like bomb a wall if they can't see the room. You know, it might not be intuitive, except for the people who have played the games all along. So they kind of had to scrap that and come up with something different. But that's something I'm going to have to think on myself. Maybe you've thought of something?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm having trouble thinking.
Yeah, I was going to think about that, but I mean, the main game that popped in my head for that was something like Dark Souls. Maybe it's a kind of cliched answer these days because everybody's saying Dark Souls this, Dark Souls that, but the way that Dark Souls worked with having a limited number of enemies or enemies in like unreachable places, you kind of had to figure out where they were and dodge what they were doing while figuring out where they are. Like I'm thinking like Undead Burg in the original Dark Souls when there's guys throwing firebombs at you and there's also guys trying to turn you into a mincemeat pie, like on the bridge, and there's this tiny little bridge and then you have to figure out where they're hiding behind another thing, and you kind of have to be paying attention to your surroundings on top of fighting people in order to make progress, or avoiding them, as is often the case when you're just trying to get to the boss or the next bonfire or whatever.
If you're going to be somewhat pedantic about that, I mean, it's certainly not the only game that's done that, but that's one of the reasons why iframes became somewhat infamous in Dark Souls. And games like Ninja Gaiden and Ninja Gaiden 2, the Xbox ones, certainly make just as, maybe not egregious, but certainly certain situations you can't deal with it unless you exploit iframes. So
Just to
your
explain,
examples are like the firebombers. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to explain iframes, that's the period of time where you're invulnerable when doing something like a dodge roll. So you have like maybe 20 frames where nothing can actually hurt you at all. It's short, which is invulnerability frames, or shortened to iframes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Please continue.
That was what I was thinking of mostly when you talk about the firebombs and stuff like that, because it's not so much that it's off screen, but because of orientation, you might not be aware of where it's coming from at first. So,
Yeah.
yeah, and they even would fine tune that in like all the way up to Dark Souls 3, where you can dodge even when you don't have stamina in like in every direction. It's really like I don't know. Some people have criticized it, but to me, it felt like a fine tuning of it that allowed you to fight even the toughest bosses with like really weak ass weapons and still be able to beat them. You know, whereas Dark Souls, not so much. You can't really do that.
Yeah. Or one really powerful weapon and no armor.
Yeah. Or it wasn't designed with that in mind, per se.
Well, we're about 10 minutes left. Do we want to open it to questions or?
You can go on, by the way, if you like to. There's nothing till 4, so it's.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
I mean, based on what you have,
Cool.
stuff like that.
Yeah. When I was trying to think of a game that exemplifies handling like limited ability to see, I was thinking of also Metroid Prime and an example where. So there's a couple examples I can think of. One is when you encounter a corridor with a bunch of enemies trying to rush at you, and I was thinking about, with the bats in Ocarina of Time, where they're just kind of all over the place. Usually they designed enemies in order to prevent that from happening or allow you to be aware of where they are in your surroundings. Not always. The ghosts are giant jerks until you get the X-ray visor. But I mean, there are some counterexamples of like combat versus exploration. But I think you also do have to explore somewhat in Metroid Prime while in combat a little bit here and there. But
Actually, you mentioning Metroid Prime, would a game from the first person's perspective be the mix of combat and exploration? Because you have to do it from the same point of view. There's no switch to a targeting system or anything like that.
yeah, no, that is one thing I was thinking of, because I was also thinking of, say, Half-Life or Half-Life 2, where you're running all over the place while fighting enemies. You're not just, targeting on something and then circling around them. You have to look around and figure out where you need to go and possibly be dodging enemies or killing enemies while not getting yourself caught in a corner where they can just come up and slice you to pieces. Yeah.
What do you guys think about 3D games that have targeting systems like Dark Souls, Zelda, and Metroid versus more American games that just have aiming, navigating through space?
I would say they both have their strengths, and strengths and weaknesses, pros, cons. Of course, everything has their strengths and weaknesses. That's kind of a non-answer. But I think it's kind of, I don't know exactly how I feel about that. Oliver, do you have anything? Or sorry, Meg, you were saying something.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think looking at Ocarina of Time, there were times where that was really great, in certain boss battles where it was a really interesting dynamic between you and the boss, and the Z targeting allowed for that. While something like bats, it was just frustrating. So I think if the enemies are designed in a way to take advantage of Z targeting, then it can be really cool. But if it's just lol, we're just gonna do that, then that doesn't necessarily have an enjoyable gaming experience.
Yeah.
Off the top of my head, I guess in terms of making a 3D game from 2D, you'd have to talk about the original Devil May Cry, but it has obvious flaws, especially because it started as a Resident Evil game. So the default I go to is Devil May Cry 3, probably because that has the most fine-tuned combat, and it also came out around the same time as Ninja Gaiden. And neither of those, actually, Devil May Cry 3 I think did have a targeting system. Did it?
Probably.
I know Ninja Gaiden didn't. And what I was going to say about that was you have Nevin, the electric guitar in Devil May Cry 3, screen clearing attacks, things like that. And that's certainly something that came from 2D. That it's what you want, especially with the multiple styles in Devil May Cry 3. You can play the game very precisely, the equivalent of parrying all the enemies, and that will leave them open, like you would later see in Dark Souls. Or you can play, balls to the wall, just destroy everything with your guns and everything like that. So it's an interesting hybrid. But I do know in Ninja Gaiden, it's the speed, how fast you can move, I think that really allows you to address that kind of stuff.
I would say that you choose one based on how you want to design the game. So a Z targeting system with Ocarina of Time was, I think, kind of a necessity that the developers chose in order to allow a player to experience this new style of game that wasn't super common at the time, or maybe even really hadn't been done. I don't know where Ocarina of Time is exactly in the range of 3D games. But you can also choose to not have targeting systems and allow somebody to perfect the art of aiming. Monster Hunter is a really good example of that, where you don't just lock on and smash away at the monster. You aim for the head, the weak point. You are very careful about where you attack and when you attack in order to be able to get out of the way.
Weak points, yeah.
Exactly. And you can even compare those between Metroid Prime with the original design, where you locked onto things like the Thardis fight, where you have to hit specific rocks on the giant golem boss to harm him. And then the remake, think they disallowed you from locking on. You had to manually aim your way onto that. So I think that's actually a good example of a game that has done both, and you can kind of compare and contrast how it operates in both modes.
It's very video gamey, and the similar example in the case of the Omega Pirate, but I allow it to get away with it because it's clearly an homage to Godzilla versus Space Godzilla, having to blow off the crystals and stuff. So it's very video gamey, but it still works. You know. You're gonna say something? Yeah.
So, do you think that we've arrived at a standard for interacting with 3D games, such as like WXD and mouse? And are we able to rely on that?
I do not believe we have reached a standard, and my two-letter response to that is VR.
Anything else?
No, I don't think I have anything else. Sorry.
One curiosity I found out about, mostly, I don't think I was going to approach it all along, was playing Diablo 3. I'm told they made some interesting changes for the console versions, adding rolling and dodging, and I'm obviously picturing Dark Souls and the other examples in my head, and I know we have it in the console room, so I might fire it up and see what it's like, because there are times where that game can seem, it's like the mouse control is so fine-tuned, it's almost like it takes the control away from you. You have to, I was playing on, if you know the game pretty well, I was playing on an expert, and I was just sitting in front of Diablo. He couldn't do anything, and I wouldn't call it a flaw per se, but it's almost like I'm interested to see how that game will play on consoles now. Like, I don't know if you have to dodge roll, anybody know, but I do know that feature is in there. So that sounds like both a compensation tool and an interesting, maybe to make the idea appealing, as opposed to like Diablo from on the original PlayStation. I think that's more of a curiosity than actually a playable game,
To kind of go a little bit farther with the question, 3D games do not have any one singular way of controlling them that is optimal. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. There are many, many ways to interact with a 3D game. There are controllers, there's now VR, there's mouse and keyboard, and each of them have a particular game styles that you really want to pair them with. You don't play Dark Souls on a keyboard. That just it's just terrible. You don't do it.
You can play it with bananas.
Yeah,
but
the opposite example right there, yeah.
Or you can play with bananas. I mean, maybe that's the optimal way, and we've all been misled our entire lives.
But even with that, there's variance with like how people will utilize certain controllers. Like with playing What Remains of Edith Finch, there's like where you're literally grabbing things and you're using the joystick to pull them. And for me, that was very unintuitive. I just expected I'd press a button and it would do the action. So like even then, that was like playing with how we use a controller.
Which I think is pulling that design decision from Amnesia, which you would interact with doors by, you'd click on it and then move your mouse to actually try and open the door.
And there are puzzle elements to Amnesia, so that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. But even in 2D, I would say we haven't figured it all out, because games are still figuring out new and interesting ways to interact with a player. I mean, look at Undertale, where it kind of breaks the norms of what you expect an RPG to be, or even an interface to be, and how mutable that is. And another Hacknet, which is basically a text adventure wrapped up in the guise of not being a text adventure. And you interact with that in multiple different ways by either typing in commands or clicking on things. I still think a lot to discover with how we can interact with the computer, and how we display that interaction to people, or even just new ways of interacting with players like VR has done, which is totally, totally different from what we've had in the past, and something we've probably been wanting for a while. And who knows what somebody's going to invent 10 years from now. I mean, nobody kind of, I guess, could imagine where 3D would go back in the day, or even that 3D was going to be this huge thing, and there it was. And then games like Portal are suddenly like, and here's a totally new type of puzzle game that nobody has done before, and it seems so obvious in retrospect. So there's always going to be stuff that's coming up, and I don't think we've reached an optimal. We've reached, I think, a really good place for a lot of games that are specialized. First-person shooters, WASD, and mouse. That's it. That's what you do. You don't do anything else because it's suboptimal. Same thing with an RTS, keyboard and mouse. Fighting games are, well, people can do anything they want with fighting games. So they can play a fight stick in a shoebox and still do top 24 of a tournament.
Are you trying to say that Capcom versus SNK wasn't awesome on GameCube? No obvious controller deficiencies that made them have to do things with that edition.
I don't know what you're talking about. No
It
problems.
was pretty much they just mapped stuff to the stick because of the analog and various other reasons. Like you could pull off a special move just by moving the C stick, and stuff like that.
Oh, like kind of like Melee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, that's probably what they were going for. I mean,
Yeah.
Usually that isn't brought up, but it probably was to help acclimate people.
Yeah.
So we've hit 3:30, so I think maybe we should formally wrap it up, but then invite people if they've got additional questions, they can talk to us. Does that sound good?
You do have an option to continue if you want, but that's up to you guys also. Like if there's anything you want to get out, like if you have somewhere to go out, by all means, somewhere to get to. But up to you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we could just stick around, and if you got questions, feel free to come and talk to us.
Thank you for coming, and enjoy the rest of MAGFest.
Yeah. Thank you very much.